28, 2021.
Good morning, Mr. Norn. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Thank you. Then we can proceed.
So, Mr.
Rutland? There. I'd just like to have you confirm that you're still under oath.
Yes, I am.
And there's one matter that I didn't attend to when I read your transcript, and that was to give you the warning that is standard with all witnesses. For whatever reason, I omitted to do it, so I'd like to do it now. I'd like to begin by informing you that pursuant to Section 8 of the Public Inquiries Act, you do have the right to object to answer any question under Section 5 of the Canada Evidence Act. The Public Inquiries Act also provides that any witness at an inquiry shall be deemed to have objected to answer any question asked of the witness on the ground that the answer of the witness may tend to incriminate the witness or may tend to establish the liability of the witness to a civil proceeding at the instance of the Crown or any person, and no answer given by a witness at an inquiry shall be used or be admissible in evidence against the witness in any trial or other proceedings against the witness taking place after the inquiry, other than a prosecution for perjury in the giving of evidence. Do you understand that?
Yes, I do.
Okay, then I propose that Mr. Cooper begin his cross-examination.
Mr. Cooper, I'm now going to call on you to cross-examine Mr. Rutland.
Thank you, sir, and good morning, Mr. Kruger, Mr. Rutland. You were already asked to confirm that you are under oath, and you acknowledge that you understand you were still under oath. The supplemental question to that, quite regularly, as you're probably familiar, is have you discussed your evidence with anybody over our rather extended break?
No, I have not.
Okay, great, thank you. We spoke to Ms. McPherson earlier in the proceedings with respect to her involvement in the preparation and training of MLAs, particularly new ones. I'm curious, first of all, as to what your involvement is in that sort of preliminary orientation of MLAs as they come into the Legislative Assembly.
Thank you. So at the time, for example, with the 19th Assembly, I was Deputy Clerk, House Procedure and Committees. So the primary focus of my work during the orientation was on House Procedure, how committees work, what committees members want, and how those committees are structured. I would provide orientation to members, or myself or members of my team would provide orientation to members on the legislative process. I also did a presentation to members on the Code of Conduct.
What information and in what form did you give this information to the MLAs in reference to the Code of Conduct? How did you impart your knowledge and experience and advice to the MLAs?
So the members, as part of their orientation package, received a series of presentations. They received hard copies of all the presentations that were going to be made, as well as I spoke probably for about at least an hour with all the members in this room and walked them through the Code of Conduct, how it applied, how it was enforced, and where else they could find what resources were available to them to find additional information or to seek additional advice around the Code of Conduct.
Did you make it clear, or did somebody in your presence or to your knowledge make it clear that the members could rely on you and your colleagues for advice in reference to the Code of Conduct?
What was made clear was that the only advice that would fully indemnify a member was advice from the Integrity Commissioner. The Act provides that if they seek advice from the Integrity Commissioner and follow that advice, they're fully indemnified. We also, in that presentation, told them that they could seek some advice or guidance from either the law clerk or the clerk of the Legislative Assembly, but on that same part of the presentation, we did underscore for them that the only full protection is advice from the Integrity Commissioner.
And in your experience as the deputy clerk or thereafter as the acting clerk, did MLAs come to you for advice under the, or in reference to the Code of Conduct?
Yeah, so they would often come and ask whether or not something may or may not be a conflict and wondering what our views were on that. Generally, my practice was always to provide some preliminary advice based on whether or not I felt there may or may not be a conflict. I would remind members the onus is on them to declare a conflict of interest, and that I would remind them that their best advice was to speak to the Integrity Commissioner.
Did the members know that you were a lawyer when you were giving them whatever advice you gave them?
I was not giving them advice in the context as a lawyer. I believe members were aware that I am a former law clerk of the Legislative Assembly, but I don't have a solicitor-client relationship with any member.
Right, and I'm not going in that direction, Mr. Rylund. I can appreciate your concern, but rather the context in which the information was received. You understood at the time that the members would reasonably have anticipated that you were a lawyer at that time. Whether or not you were acting in that capacity, you did have that certification, that you were a lawyer while you were the deputy clerk or acting clerk, correct?
I can't speak to what a member may or may not have been thinking.
Well, I'm asking you from the knowledge that you have from your interaction with members, did you do anything then to discourage the members from treating you as a lawyer, as their lawyer, or as a lawyer giving advice to somebody?
If that came up in the conversation, I would underscore to them that, in fact, I wasn't acting as their lawyer. And as I indicated earlier, my practice is that anytime a member seeks such advice, I always advise them that their best recourse is to speak to the Integrity Commissioner.
Did you take any steps? Did you provide any information to discourage an MLA from treating you as their lawyer, giving them legal advice?
Yes, I would tell them that that was the role of the law clerk and the deputy law clerk, and it's not my role to provide legal advice.
And you told the members inquiring of you that information every time?
That's my usual practice. I can't say that I did it every time, but that would be my normal practice.
Did you take notes of any of your communications with the MLAs with respect to advice sought on the Code of Conduct during this session?
I may have some general notes, but just acknowledging the fact that I spoke to a member about an issue. Sometimes members seek advice by email, other times it's strictly oral, and no, I would not have notes.
With respect to communications that you had with Mr. Norn during the 19th session of the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories, do you recall taking any notes?
Notes in relation just to my discussions with Mr. Noren, or discussions specific to advice relating to the Code of Conduct?
With respect to Mr. Norn more generally,
Yes.
what was the nature of the advice sought by Mr. Norn on those occasions?
Most of the time it was just notes regarding communications, summaries of some of our communications. Generally, there wasn't direct questions as it relates to the Code of Conduct or specific advice on that.
Did you come to the conclusion as the 19th session progressed that Mr. Norn came to rely on your advice about a variety of matters?
During the 19th Assembly, I would say that for the first up till February of this year, I worked very closely with Mr. Noren, and that was because I was Mr. Noren's committee clerk for the committee that he chaired. So yes, we worked quite closely together in that context. And that was until February of this year when it became acting clerk, at which point I no longer supported the committees. So that would be the first time our working relationship changed.
On an informal basis, though, I understand, and we've heard evidence to support this understanding, Mr. Norn did continue to rely on you for advice and instructions with respect to his duties as an MLA, even after you became the deputy clerk, correct?
Certainly Mr. Noren would discuss things with me. I would not say that Mr. Noren was seeking instructions, but certainly we would discuss things. It's not my place. Beyond strictly procedural matters in a committee, it is not my place to instruct an MLA.
Your role, though, as deputy clerk and even as law clerk, I presume, was to give advice to MLAs, correct?
As law clerk, my role was to provide legal advice in relation to legal matters associated with their role. As deputy clerk, my role was to give procedural advice.
When did you change positions between law clerk and deputy clerk? When did that transition occur?
That transition happened in the 18th Assembly in May of 2019, before Mr. Noren was elected.
You understood that Mr. Norn perceived you as part of his support structure in the Legislative Assembly, in whatever capacity you were serving, correct?
Yes.
And I understand that you weren't passive in your advice to Mr. Norn, but rather you were often proactive in giving advice and information to Mr. Norn, correct?
In the absence of any sort of circumstances, it would be difficult to consider whether something was proactive or reactive.
Okay. Did you see instances or learn of instances involving Mr. Norn in which you picked up the phone to call him as opposed to him calling you?
Yes, for example, when I discovered Mr. Noren had been at the Legislative Assembly during his isolation period, that would be a time where I would pick up the phone and call Mr. Noren.
Okay, so you felt free in your relationship with this particular MLA, at least, to call him up with advice not sought, correct?
No, I would not say that is correct.
Did you, on more than the occasion that you've just described, initiate communication with Mr. Norn about matters in which you gave advice?
So I'm just conscious of the relevance of the matters in this proceeding here, and I just want to make sure that we're sticking to the two issues that are at play that the adjudicator has discussed on a number of occasions. Those being investigation, the allegation that Mr. Norn breached his period of self-isolation, and whether he misled the public. And so I'd just like to request that the questions relate to those two matters in issue. Thank you.
In fairness to Mr. Noren, this is a little different situation because Mr. LaPrairie put this witness on the stand for certain reasons, and we're now in cross-examination. So I'm going to give Mr. Cooper some leeway in his cross-examination. However, I think he's well aware of my previous rulings in respect to the atmosphere in the House, and I would object if he goes down that road path, but otherwise I'm going to give him some leeway.
Thank you, sir. To give my friend and yourself some comfort, this all, I think, quite obviously, when the examination on this area is complete, ties into the circumstances around the press release, which is really what we're leading up to, and the interaction and the history of that interaction. So I'm going to ask...
You're certainly not entitled to cross-examine in that area because it was Mr. LaPrairie that brought that matter to my attention.
Thank you, sir. So, Mr. Rutland, I don't know if you recall the question. I'm not sure that I do. I believe I was asking you specifically about interaction with Mr. Norn that had you proactively giving him advice.
Well, there are
Do you
certain
recall it?
well,
Sorry,
there
go
are
ahead.
certainly times where I would have spoken with Mr. Norn and would have contacted Mr. Norn, and in the context of that communication, provided him advice.
Okay. I guess what I'm getting at, Mr. Rylund, on this point is you saw no barrier to picking up the phone to call Mr. Norn to give him advice. You didn't have to wait for your phone to ring, right?
Depending on a situation, that's not something I would routinely do. It was something that would be situation specific.
Okay. But if you saw or experienced something that Mr. Norn was doing in his capacity as an elected representative that caused you concern, you felt it was in your responsibility to call Mr. Norn up and say, I should give you some advice on this, correct?
No, I don't think that's a correct summary of what I was saying. There are plenty of things that Mr. Noren and other MLAs have done where I have not taken any action whatsoever to, as you indicate, proactively provide advice. Members are free to do what they wish as long as within the rules and confines of the Legislative Assembly. Where there are matters that affect the Assembly, I am more likely to pick up the phone and call any member. Yes.
Okay. That's all I'm getting at, Mr. Rylund. It's not a one-way communication. You, as a deputy clerk, understood your role during the 19th Assembly included the ability to pick up a phone or to initiate an email communication to MLAs who may be doing something that you thought they should reconsider, right?
No, I may provide a perspective, but I wouldn't tell them to reconsider what they're doing.
Well, you'd give them advice. That's your job as a deputy clerk, is to give MLAs advice, correct?
Procedural advice, yes.
Okay. Procedural advice, though, I presume includes advice about dealing with the media. Is that right?
That advice is primarily given by our Public Affairs and Communications group, but in the context of working with members on their initiatives or on committees, we would also provide them with advice on that.
Let's narrow it down to press releases. You saw your responsibility as the acting clerk in April of this year as including giving advice to MLAs about press releases, correct?
Well, in April of this year, Mr. Noren sought my advice on whether or not to do a media statement in relation to his COVID-19 diagnosis.
So Mr. Noren contacts Mr. Rylund. Mr. Rylund assists Mr. Noren in preparing a press release. Did I just describe correctly what happened in April of this year?
Yes, that is correct.
And as part of that interaction, you provided input and advice to Mr. Norn in preparation of the press release, which was ultimately distributed on April 23rd of this year, correct?
Yes, Mr. Noren and I had a conversation about whether or not he wanted to release a public statement. We had discussions about the merits or benefits of doing that versus not doing it. And then I also provided advice on what he should not say in the press release.
And what you told him not to say in the press release was anything indicating that he had followed all of the rules. Wasn't that the critical phrase?
Yes.
This wasn't a monologue, as I understand it. This wasn't Mr. Noren telling you what to do. This was a dialogue between yourself and Mr. Noren, which resulted in the press release, which was issued on April 23rd of this year, correct?
Well, the press release resulted from direction from Mr. Noren, yes.
direction, as I understand the evidence thus far, which included your input and advice, correct?
Yes.
And he took your advice, Mr. R.L, correct?
I think that's debatable. Mr. Noren told the next morning, Mr. Noren made a public statement saying that he had followed all the rules.
Okay. I'm talking about the press release, so let's just limit your answer at this point to the press release. The press release is an example of where Mr. Noren took your advice, correct?
Yes.
Don't say anything about following the rules in the press release and he complied with that particular piece of advice, correct?
Yes.
When the press release was being discussed on April 23rd, you already knew that Mr. Noren had attended the Legislative Assembly earlier, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
You knew because of your own investigations, correct?
That I asked the Sergeant at Arms to review the security register.
Okay. And that was subsequently confirmed in your conversation with Mr. Noren, correct?
Yes, the conversation with Mr. Noren first indicated to me that he wasn't there on the 17th, he was there on the 18th. I indicated to him that, in fact, the security register showed that he was there on the 17th, at which point Mr. Noren told me that he had a political exemption from the public health officer to be out of isolation. And I questioned him on that because I had no knowledge of that, and previous members had to isolate the full time.
He told you he had what?
When I first asked Mr. Noren about coming to the Legislative Assembly, he indicated that there was a political exemption for political leaders, and I indicated to him that I was not aware of that, and that other members had been required to isolate fully.
During your conversation, Mr. Noren acknowledged that he may have been in error with respect to the date of his attendance, correct?
After I indicated that the report showed he was there on the 17th, yes.
He didn't try to obfuscate or confuse the issue at that point. He said words to the effect of, "Oh, I must have been mistaken," correct?
Well, following my conversation with Mr. Noren proceeded to call the Sergeant at Arms, told the Sergeant at Arms that he didn't think he was there on the 17th, and asked whether or not there was security camera footage. And the Sergeant at Arms advised him that there was.
Okay. But during your call with Mr. Noren, preparatory to the press release, he did acknowledge to you that he was there on the 17th. That's what you told Mr. LaPrairie. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay. He, at that point, didn't try to convince you that he was there on the 18th, not the 17th, did he?
No, I advised him that the security register showed he was there on the 17th.
The press release that was issued on the 23rd was approved by Mr. Noren in the email exchange that was made an exhibit to these proceedings. And thereafter, the press release was issued, correct?
Yes, the press release was sent directly to CBC that evening because they were the ones who were, based on the information shared by Mr. Noren, were prepared to report on it. And then the next morning, it was sent out to the rest of the media. And that was simply because our manager of public affairs could not access the distribution list remotely Thursday night.
The press release, as I understand it, was something that you, as the acting clerk, felt was necessary in view of the contact at that point from the CBC reporter, correct?
My understanding was that the CBC was prepared, they had enough sources prepared to proceed with a story identifying Mr. Noren. I indicated to Mr. Noren that he could choose to make a statement or choose not to make a statement. By making a statement, he would be getting ahead and his response would be included in the story, or he could wait and do responses the next day.
And what did he indicate to you after hearing that advice that he wanted to do?
Mr. Noren directed that we prepare a statement.
So he took your advice to get ahead of the story and to have your office assist in preparing the press release that was issued on April 23rd of this year, correct?
Yeah, Mr. Noren asked for our assistance in preparing the press release because by that time he was in the isolation center and only had his phone and didn't have access to a computer or anything, which is why we typed up and prepared the media statement for him.
But he did that, Mr. Rylund, on your advice, correct?
I can't say what was the final factor in Mr. Noren's decision. Certainly, I provided him those options, but I can't speak to what was the reason Mr. Noren decided to do it.
Let's look at the order of events. Your office was contacted by the CBC before any discussion about a press release between yourself and Mr. Noren, correct?
No, that's not correct.
Okay. What was the first step leading to your knowledge that led towards the press release being issued on April 23rd?
My understanding is that Mr. Noren had been in touch with the Premier's office regarding this and had been seeking assistance from the Premier's communications assistance from the Speaker's office, and he was from the Cabinet Communications, and he was redirected to speak to me.
So your recollection was that Mr. Noren wanted to issue the press release before you ever raised the possibility with him? Is that right?
No, that's not what I said.
Okay, then clarify that.
Mr. Noren, my understanding is Mr. Noren had been in contact with the Premier's office regarding seeking communications advice. Whether or not that was to issue a statement or not at that point, I don't know.
Okay. But your first involvement was to contact Mr. Noren to suggest that he get ahead of the story by issuing a press release, correct?
My recollection is that Mr. Noren contacted me because he had been redirected to me from the Premier's office.
Did he ask you to prepare a press release, or did you suggest that he prepare a press release?
We discussed, as I said earlier, we discussed the merits of whether or not to do a statement, and then Mr. Noren directed that we prepare a statement based on my conversation with him.
But he did that based on your advice, correct? From your understanding of the communications.
I can't say why Mr. Noren made the final decision. I can say that we did discuss the merits of doing it, and then he provided the direction to do it.
You said that you learned of a communication between Mr. Noren and the Premier's office. Is that right?
Yes.
How did that information get to you?
I received a call from the Premier's office saying that they were redirecting Mr. Noren to me, and then Mr. Noren also told me that he had been in touch with the Premier's office.
But the first knowledge that you had that Mr. Noren had been in touch with the Premier's office on this issue was from somebody at the Premier's office, correct?
That's correct.
Who was that person?
The Principal Secretary to the Premier.
What's the Principal Secretary's name as it was in April of this year?
Shalene Woodward.
And what is your understanding of the reporting relationship between Ms. Woodward and the Premier?
Ms. Woodward is the principal secretary to the Premier, so my understanding is she would report to the Premier.
What information precisely did Ms. Woodward give to you with respect to this issue? What did she tell you?
She told me that Mr. Norn had been in contact with the Premier's office seeking communications advice in relation to media inquiries from CBC, and that they had redirected him to me.
Did she use the word redirect?
I can't say whether it's redirect or whether directed, but Cabinet Communications does not provide communications advice to regular members. The Office of the Clerk does that.
Did Ms. Woodward give you any insight into the conversation between the Premier and Mr. Norn with respect to the issues touched upon in the press release?
No.
Was there any communication between Ms. Woodward or anybody else at the Premier's office and yourself on the issues touched upon in the press release of April 23rd of this year?
No.
The communication then was in the form of a telephone call, I take it?
Yes.
Was there anybody else on the call, to your knowledge?
No.
What was your response to Ms. Woodward?
That I would wait for Mr. Noren and would provide assistance to him.
So you told Ms. Woodward that you wouldn't initiate the communication with Mr. Norn on this issue, that you would passively wait for him to call you. Is that right?
My understanding is that Mr. Noren had been directed to call me, so I said that I would wait to hear from him.
But I take it you intended to call him if you didn't hear from him fairly promptly.
I can't say what I would or wouldn't have done. Mr. Noren did call me, and that's how we discussed it.
How long after your call with Ms. Woodward did Mr. Norn call you?
I can't recall.
Minutes, days, hours?
It was all the same evening.
Did you take any notes of your communication with Ms. Woodward?
No.
Did you contact anybody other than Mr. Norn in response to the information provided by Ms. Woodward during this call?
No, not until after I had spoken with Mr. Noren, at which point I brought in our Manager of Public Affairs and Communications to assist. That was Nicole Bonnell, and I'd shared with her what had happened during the evening.
Is it correct that you already knew that Mr. Norn had been in the Legislative Assembly by the time you got the call from Ms. Woodward?
Yes.
Did you talk to Ms. Woodward about that fact? Did you relay the information to Ms. Woodward that you had evidence that Mr. Norn had visited the Legislative Assembly on the 17th of that month?
I don't know if I'd spoken with her before or after that call about that. I did speak with her at one point because we were notifying building occupants about a potential exposure. I don't know whether it took place before or after that call.
Did Ms. Woodward express any concerns that the Premier had with the fact that the media were contacting the Premier's office about this issue?
No.
Did she pass on to you any sense that the Premier was pressuring Mr. Norn to issue a public statement about the matters that were subsequently covered in the press release?
No.
Did you ask Ms. Woodward or anybody else at the Premier's office about their view of the circumstances that were then known?
No.
Did anybody at that time, Mr. Rylund, give you a sense that Mr. Norn was being pressured to make a public statement about the matters which subsequently found their way into the press release of April 23 of this year?
No.
Did Mr. Norn indicate to you around the time that the press release was issued that he felt under pressure from anybody to make a public statement? about the matters that are covered in the press release?
No.
Do you recall Mr. Norn expressing that he was under a lot of stress at the time?
Yes.
Did Mr. Norn indicate that he was feeling very tired and having difficulty sleeping as a result of the events that were in some degree described in the press release?
During that call, no. Subsequent calls, yes.
And how far subsequent are those calls in which it was apparent to you that Mr. Norn was in some distress?
Mr. Norn identified that he was in some distress, and I would say that those comments started the next day after it was publicly reported that he had been at the Legislative Assembly.
Did you have a sense just before the press release that there was increasing media and public pressure to have the information distributed that subsequently made its way into the press release?
No, I was just aware that CBC was prepared to run a story to that effect.
Were you given any information as to how CBC had acquired the information to which the Premier's office and Mr. Norn essentially were being asked to respond?
No, in discussion with Mr. Norn, I had asked him who he had indicated or who he had told that he had tested positive to identify whether or not, in fact, there were sources who could possibly identify him. In that discussion, he indicated to me that he had told his constituency assistants and that one of his constituency assistants had also shared that information with the chiefs. So at that point, in my view, there was a credible chance that, in fact, CBC did have confirmation that it was Mr. Norn, based on the number of people who knew.
Did Ms. Woodward, in her communications on behalf of the Premier, indicate any sense of urgency in dealing with this matter?
All Ms. Woodward did was indicate what call had taken place to them and that they had redirected Mr. Norn to me.
And I'm sorry if I touched on this earlier, but was it apparent to you that the Premier's office knew that there had been a visit by Mr. Norn on April 17th to the Legislative Assembly?
No, because I can't recall when I had that conversation with him, whether it was before or after this call. It was around, most likely it was probably the next day, but I can't say for sure.
Was there any reason that you didn't tell Ms. Woodward what you knew about that visit during that call?
During that call, we weren't discussing the actual circumstances of Mr. Norn. It was simply a heads up that this was going on and Mr. Norn had been redirected to speak to me. My conversations with members are not something I share with the Premier's office, unless specifically instructed to by a member.
By the time you received the call from Ms. Woodward, you already knew two things. Mr. Norn had attended the Legislative Assembly, and I believe at that point you already knew that he had tested COVID positive, correct?
Yes, on the Wednesday, Mr. Noren contacted me and Wednesday evening, he told me that he had been tested positive for COVID-19. Thursday during the day was just before noon was when I discovered he'd been at the Legislative Assembly. And then Thursday evening was when we discussed and assisted him in preparing his media statement.
So the answer is yes. When you spoke to Ms. Woodward, you already knew that Mr. Noren had visited the Assembly and that he was COVID positive, correct?
Yes, and I knew that Ms. Woodward knew he was COVID positive because Mr. Noren had told me that the day before.
So rather than asking Ms. Woodward if the Premier's office was aware of those two facts, you relied on the fact that Mr. Norn assured you that he had told the Premier's office already. Am I understanding you correctly, Mr. R.L?
Yes, when Mr. Norn called me on the Wednesday night to tell me that he had tested positive for COVID and had gone to the isolation center, he told me that he had already spoken with the Premier.
And it never occurred to you to ask Ms. Woodward to confirm that rather important and relevant information. Is that right?
My conversation with members, as I indicated earlier, is not something I share with the Premier's office. We're two separate branches of government.
No, I appreciate that. But what you knew at that point was Mr. Norn told you he'd already told the Premier's office. You're not breaching any confidences if that had happened. And at the same time, you're being called by a representative of the Premier to talk about media inquiries into the very same thing. Why didn't you actually just tell Ms. Woodward what you knew about his visit and the fact that he was COVID positive, even if some of that was already in her knowledge?
Because my conversations with members, including my conversation with Mr. Noren as to whether or not he'd been at the Assembly, is not something I would share with the Premier's office. I did share it with the Premier's office based on doing notifications, but at the time, I wasn't discussing the merits or content of a member's media statement with a representative of the executive.
So you absolutely did not tell Ms. Woodward that Mr. Norn, to your knowledge at that point, had already visited the Legislative Assembly days before. You didn't tell her that.
I've already testified that I've told Ms. Woodward that. I just can't recall whether I told her that before or after this phone call.
Do you have any notes that would refresh your memory in that regard, Mr. Butler?
No, not that I recall.
In what form did you actually communicate that information then to the Premier's office?
I went up and
Norn, just to be clear, that Mr. Norn had visited the Assembly on April 17th and that you had evidence confirming that information.
I went to Ms. Woodward's office.
You just don't remember whether it was before or after the press release was issued?
Yes, that's correct.
If I'm understanding your testimony on this point correctly, you say you didn't feel free to pass on the information about Mr. Norn's attendance because of the separation between your office and the Premier's office. Is that right?
No, I said that was my practice, that I don't discuss my conversations with members with the Premier's office unless I'm specifically instructed to.
And I understood that you used that consideration in not telling Ms. Woodward what you knew about the visit. You don't talk about things that the MLAs talk to you about to the Premier's office, right?
Unless instructed otherwise, or else there is some other relevant reason why I would be required to do so.
Well, did Mr. Norn tell you to talk to the Premier about the visit that he made on April 17th?
No, once it was determined that we had an exposure at the Legislative Assembly, the process at that point is to advise, because the Premier's office and certain members of the Executive Council work in the Legislative Assembly, that we would notify them of an exposure.
Well, the reality of it is you didn't need Mr. Norn's permission to talk to the Premier about his visit, because you went ahead and talked to the Premier's office anyways without seeking or receiving his permission, correct?
No, that's not a correct clarification. I did it based on our practice in relation to a COVID exposure at the Legislative Assembly.
Absolutely, and I think we all agree that it was important that you speak to the Premier's office as quickly as possible, having learned that there was possible exposure, correct? No issue there.
Correct.
So I don't understand your reluctance to have discussed that very issue with Ms. Woodward when she called you before the press release was issued on April 23rd. There was no barriers to you disclosing that information. In fact, there was a positive obligation, Mr. Rylund, on your part to make sure that the Premier was advised as quickly as possible, correct?
Well, no, the Premier's office, not necessarily the Premier. Second of all, the purpose of Ms. Woodward's call was to let me know that they had redirected Mr. Noren to me to seek assistance regarding a media reply. I would not discuss the contents of what may or may not be in that media reply with the Premier's office.
No, I understand that, but you've acknowledged that you did not tell or don't recall telling Ms. Woodward about the April 17th visit, and I understood your earlier evidence to suggest the reason for that was that you don't discuss MLA matters with the Premier's office. Yes,
as I said, I wouldn't discuss, for example, if a member is advised to contact me regarding, assistance on a matter, I would not report back or discuss that assistance with the Premier's office, which is why I wouldn't have got into that on the conversation. At that point, Mr. Noren had not contacted me seeking that assistance yet.
The exposure control protocol requires you and anybody else at the Legislative Assembly to immediately disclose any potential exposure to, amongst others, the Premier's office, correct?
Well, first, it requires the Sergeant at Arms to investigate. Then, based on that investigation, we speak with public health to ensure that all the steps that we are taking is consistent with that. I think one of the reasons why it became more of a conversation was the fact that once it was reported that Mr. Norn had received a positive COVID-19 diagnosis, staff were asking questions as to whether or not Mr. Norn had been in the building, obviously not just out of concern.
Well, you already knew, Mr. Rylund, that he was in the building. You already knew that he was COVID positive. Why not ensure at that moment, that critical moment, that the Premier's office was aware? Why not?
Because that was not the purpose of that conversation. And as I said, I'm not sure whether I had already told them or I told them after. I don't recall that detail. But at the time, the call was simply to give me a heads up that Mr. Noren may be contacting me for assistance.
You knew at the time that timing was everything in terms of controlling exposure to COVID. You knew that in April of this year, right?
I'm not sure I would say that I fully understand all the medical aspects of it. What I did know was that after Mr. Noren identified that he was a positive diagnosis, I asked to see whether he had been in the building and then acted accordingly on the result of that.
Mr. Rylund, did you yourself see the final version of the press release before it was issued?
Yes, I did.
Did you notice that there was nothing in there about the visit on April 17th by Mr. Norn?
Yes.
Did it occur to you to contact Mr. Norn to provide him with more advice on the press release in that regard?
Well, we had discussed as part of the conversation with Mr. Noren about whether or not to make a media statement as to whether or not he wanted to address the fact he was at the Legislative Assembly. And based on the final version, that the indication was that no, he did not want that in there.
What form did that communication take?
We were speaking verbally on the phone. And then we were also following up both by text and by email as drafts of the press release were going back and forth.
Did you document your... No, let's back up. Did you tell Mr. Norn that you were concerned that he was not going to include reference to his April 17th visit to the legislature?
I know when I spoke with Mr. Noren, we had discussed whether or not to address those. And in terms of our discussion back and forth, ultimately, what I do recall is just saying that that Mr. Noren could not say that he had followed the rules because, in fact, we knew he had not.
You took your advice to leave that reference that I had followed the rules out of the press release, correct?
That's the decision he made, yes.
Okay, but that was based on what you can tell on advice. At least your advice contributed to that decision, was what you concluded, correct?
I can't conclude what made Mr. Noren make that final decision.
Did Mr. Noren give you any information that he was consulting with anybody else in reference to this press release?
Not that I recall.
Did you ask Mr. Noren if he was receiving any other advice with respect to this press release?
Not that I recall.
This press release was put together in just a couple of hours, I think, correct?
Yes.
Is the press release accurate, in your view?
Yes.
It's the truth, right?
It says that Mr. Noren's intention is that when he was isolating, that he'd filed an isolation plan and that he would isolate at home.
The press release is the truth, correct, Mr. Rutland?
That's ultimately a question for Mr. Noren.
No, I'm asking your view.
I believe it to be accurate.
Okay. Do you believe, sir, that it is the whole truth?
I believe it to be accurate.
Is it the whole truth?
That would be a question for Mr. Noren.
No, I'm asking your opinion. In your opinion, having been involved in that press release, is this press release the whole truth?
So the question has now been asked 3 or 4 times, and the witness's answer has been the same, that he believes it's accurate. So I'm not sure what else, what purpose asking the question again will serve.
He hasn't answered
Yeah,
the
I think that Mr. Cooper is a fair criticism. You have asked that question several times, and Mr. Rutland has responded, and we're bound by his answer.
He is, sir, but he's provided an answer, which is different on cross-examination than an answer that is responsive. He's actually avoided answering a simple question, which is whether he believes that this was the whole truth. That it's a very simple question, and if it makes it easier and more appropriate, I can limit the question to at the time that the press release was issued. I'm not asking for his retrospective. I'm simply asking him if, in his view, this press release, which he had a hand in drafting, is the whole truth. I think it's a fair question, and the only reason it's been asked multiple times is it hasn't had a responsive answer, just an answer.
Well, I'm going to ask him to answer that question, but don't repeat it. I think we're going through this. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
At the time, I would say that no, I was not convinced it was the whole truth. And the reason for that was that in my multiple discussions with Mr. Noren from the time that I found out that he had been COVID positive, he had frequently changed some of the information that he provided. For example, referring to the political exemption, referring to the fact that, no, he was there another day. While we were preparing the media statement, I asked him a number of questions regarding his isolation, and during that, Mr. Norn frequently changed the information that he was providing me. So no, I was not convinced that all of the information would have been included in that press statement, but I am convinced that the press statement that was issued was in fact accurate.
Is there some reason you haven't mentioned this alleged political exemption previously in your statement to Mr. LaPrairie or under examination by Mr. LaPrairie?
At that
It
point,
just seems to have popped up today.
no, it was something that Mr. Noren had raised with me at the time. It's come up today in the context of the questions that have been asked. Previously, it was just, previously what I had been asked was whether or not Mr. Noren had confirmed that he had been at the Legislative Assembly while he was isolating.
And you never thought, as a man with legal training, that it might be legally relevant to suggest to Mr. LaPrairie in his previous examination of you that there was this allegation that Mr. Noren was trying to rely on a non-existent political exemption. It never occurred to you to volunteer that information, Mr. Rylund?
No, it's just the same as I previously hasn't indicated that Mr. Noren frequently changed the information that he was providing me while we were preparing the member's statement. I try to exercise a certain amount of discretion in the work that I do for members. But in asking whether or not, in my opinion, it was the whole truth, then I felt compelled to state why I did not believe it to be the whole truth.
But in fairness, Mr. Rylund, you first raised the allegation of a reference to a political exemption before I asked you questions about the truth and the whole truth, and we didn't even get to nothing but the truth. So I'm curious what it was that triggered your memory with respect to this allegation, that such that it didn't come up previously in anything that Mr. LaPrairie asked you. It's a curious thing to leave out, Mr. Rylund, and I'm giving you an opportunity to explain why it wasn't included previously.
Because it wasn't addressed previously, you were asking me very specific questions about my conversations with Mr. Noren about his attendance at the Legislative Assembly and whether or not he had challenged me when I said he was there on the 17th. So when you asked whether or not he had challenged me on that, then I shared that information because it was relevant to the fact of whether or not he had challenged the information that he was there on the 17th. Previously, it had not been relevant to whether or not Mr. Noren had been at the Assembly while he was isolated.
So in your view, with your legal training and your position as law clerk previously, and deputy clerk and acting clerk, none of that experience or knowledge suggested to you that maybe you should mention that to inquiry counsel as something that might be relevant to the inquiry?
What I was being asked and what was relevant to the inquiry was whether or not Mr. Noren attended at the Legislative Assembly on April 17th when he was to be self-isolating. And I answered all of the questions in relation to that. I'm a witness on the stand answering the questions that I'm asked.
I guess we'll leave it at that, Mr. Rylund, and leave it to others to ponder why it was that wasn't volunteered previously and has only been, and for the record, has only formed part of the evidence today. You said that you saw the final version of the press release before it was released first to CBC, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Did you make any effort to contact Mr. Noren at that point to suggest that he should include reference to the visit on April 17th?
It was all part of the same conversations, that the approval of the final release was with Mr. Noren, not with myself. And as I indicated earlier, that was decisions that we were those were items that we discussed during my conversation with him, and the press release that was issued reflects the direction provided by Mr. Noren for the press statement.
That's not what I'm asking you. You're doing a retrospective. Once you saw the final version, you saw and just to be clear, you saw the final version approved by Mr. Noren before it was submitted to the CBC, correct? did it occur to you that it would be appropriate to contact Mr. Norn to suggest that he include the fact that he had visited on April 17th? Did it even occur to you to do something, whether you did it or not, after seeing the final version?
We had already had that conversation before the final version was prepared. The final version was based on the direction provided by Mr. Norn.
Okay, so your evidence under oath, Mr. Rylund, is that you specifically advised Mr. Norn that he should include reference to his April 17th visit. Is that right?
No, that's not my evidence. My evidence is that's something we discussed, whether or not it could be included. And that was one of the items we discussed in the preparation of the statement. But ultimately,
what
decisions...
What was your advice on that? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. Cooper. But decisions on the content of the press release rests with the member.
Did you specifically advise Mr. Norn about the inclusion or exclusion of his visit to April 17th?
We discussed whether or not Mr. Noren wanted that included.
And what was your advice to him in that regard, Mr. Rupp?
I asked whether he wanted that included, and Mr. Noren indicated he did not.
You specifically advised, very forcefully I understand, that Mr. Norn not make reference to the fact that he followed all the rules, correct? You gave him specific advice on that point, right?
Yes, and in my recollection, that is because Mr. Noren wanted to include a statement to that effect, and I told him that he could not do that.
You told him he could not do that. Is that what you said to him? You cannot do that.
I can't say for the specific word. That is what I just said now. What I said 7 months ago, I can't say whether I said could, should, I can't recall.
Because cannot or could not seems to me to be instructions, not advice. Would you agree?
Well, Mr. Noren has publicly taken great offense to the thought that we may provide instructions or treat them like employees. So no, ultimately I take direction from members, but that would be something where a statement that is incorrect to that nature, I certainly would take great issue with putting out on Legislative Assembly letterhead.
Yet you were content with the fact that the rather essential fact that he had actually visited the Assembly on the 17th. You were okay leaving that out on Assembly letterhead. Am I correct? You understand?
Well, the information was not included, but there was also nothing in the statement that said he did or did not follow his isolation plan. There is nothing that indicates otherwise.
Mr. Rutland, did you think it unimportant for the public to know that Mr. Noren had visited the Assembly on April 17th, 2021?
I think it was Mr. Noren's decision as to what information he shared.
When I asked you, you're in an advisory role, so your opinion on such matters are relevant and indeed important to this inquiry. Did you think it unimportant that the public know that Mr. Noren had attended the Legislative Assembly on April 17th?
What I can say is that I did provide, we did discuss with Mr. Noren whether or not he specifically wanted to include that in his media statement.
Did you advise him that he must include that information, Mr. Rupp?
No, I would not say must.
Well, you told him, apparently, under oath, you've just told us, that he could not do something. So, logically, that would give you, in your understanding, the ability to tell him what he must do. Do you agree with that?
No.
So you understood that you had the ability to tell Mr. Noren what he could not do in a press release, but did not have a similar capacity to tell him what he must do in a press release. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mr. Noren's decision to issue the press statement was his. It was his decision to identify that he had identified, had been diagnosed with COVID-19. It was his decision not to include that he was at the Legislative Assembly. the distinction there is saying something that is flat out wrong versus not including every piece of information. There is a distinction between those, and I would think that would be the distinction that would affect what advice was given.
Kind of like that oath that we hear so often, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So what you're telling me is an act of commission is not permitted, but an act of omission is permitted. Am I correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by commission.
Okay, well, he could not, in your view, make reference to something that was not true, i.e., I followed all the rules, right? He couldn't do that, right?
Yes.
But he could leave out critical, relevant information by omission. That's okay in your mind in April 2021, right?
That was within his decision to make, yes.
Okay, so that's what I mean, Mr. Rylund, so that we're clear. You were not content by the act of commission, where he says something in a press release that's untrue, but you were perfectly okay with the act of omission, leaving out critically relevant information in the very same press release. Am I understanding you correctly?
No.
Okay. What's the difference between putting something in that's untrue or leaving something out that's critical to understand the circumstances in a press release?
I think what I disagreed with was when you said that I was perfectly okay with it. I said that was a decision within Mr. Noren's ability to make, and not something that I, for example, I feel confident in saying, you know, we're not going to put out a press release that says you followed all of the rules. The fact that Mr. Noren may leave out information as to whether or not he attended the Legislative Assembly, you know, had other contact with other people who are isolating, those different things, that was within Mr. Noren's full decision-making capability. And whether or not I agreed with Mr. Noren's decisions, my job was to take instructions and have Mr. Noren's statement issued.
Well, take instructions up to a point. You would not include something that wasn't true in the press release, right?
Yeah, I've already said that.
Right. And Mr. Noren, therefore, was not free to put anything that he wanted into the press release, correct?
No, I indicated there are certain things that were fully within his decision-making.
So you had the authority as the acting clerk in April of this year to refuse to issue a press release that contained something that was untrue, correct?
I don't know. That situation didn't present itself. Mr. Noren was agreed with not putting in that he followed all the rules. So whether or not I would make the decision to not issue it, I didn't have to make.
Okay, you did have the authority, you understood at the time, under certain circumstances, to refuse to issue a press release in April of this year, correct?
I don't know. I hadn't done that before. Certainly, I think it was something I would be prepared to do, but I hadn't done that before.
Okay. So you understood that theoretically, at least, you had the authority to refuse to issue a press release on Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly letterhead that contained an untruth. You had that authority, correct?
I was prepared to test whether or not I had that authority. Whether I did or not, at that point, I had been only acting clerk for about 2 months.
Okay, but you certainly had resources to help you determine what authority you had on that issue, correct?
No, I was having to make a lot of decisions based on what I thought was the best or correct decision. But no, there's not a manual for being clerk of the Legislative Assembly.
No, I understand that, but you certainly had reference to experienced counsel Sheila McPherson to ask whether you could refuse to issue a press release, correct?
The law clerk provides legal advice. I'm not sure whether that's a legal question, but if it was, that's a path I could have gone down, but I did not at the time because it was not necessary.
Well, it was important, though, Mr. Rylund, for you to understand at that point what authority you had in the event that Mr. Norn had refused your advice, correct?
Well, that's a hypothetical situation at this point.
Well, it's not hypothetical. I'm just wondering whether, in fact, you considered whether or not you would issue the press release if you were uncomfortable with its contents. Did you actually consider that?
I didn't have to make a final determination on that point. Certainly, my personal inclination would be no, we would not issue that. Mr. Noren could issue that statement personally, but it would not be issued by the Assembly.
By the Assembly, what you're really saying is you, as the acting clerk, would have refused or could have refused to issue a press release that was not completely accurate and truthful, correct?
It was something that was in my mind. Whether or not I could or would do that, I didn't have to make that decision. But it was something that was in my mind, yes.
Okay, but you were comfortable enough with the contents, including the omission of reference to the April 17th visit by Mr. Norn, to approve the press release to be issued, correct?
I'm not fully comfortable with the word approve, because I think had I intervened to prevent it from going out, that would have been unusual. Normally, I would not see a member's individual press statement. I was involved in the preparation of this one at the request of Mr. Norn.
But in your capacity as the clerk of the Legislative Assembly, you understood that there was at least a possibility that you could refuse to issue the press release on Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly letterhead, correct? You had that authority or thought you might, correct?
I thought I might, yes.
Okay, so that implies, and you understood that at the time, that you had the right to refuse and therefore had the right to approve the final version of a press release issued on Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly letterhead in April of this year, correct?
I think that's probably a reasonable inference. That's not, like I said, it's normally not routine for the clerk to approve individual members' news releases. This situation was different because of my direct involvement at Mr. Norton's request in the preparation of the statement and my direct knowledge of the fact that Mr. Norton had not complied with the self-isolation requirements. So this situation was highly unusual. But yes, I think that's a reasonable inference.
And yet approve the issuance of the press release you did, correct?
I think the witness has already said that he's not comfortable with the word approve. And again, I think we're getting into the territory of re-asking questions that have been asked a number of times on which you have the witness's evidence already.
Well, it's a natural.
Yeah, I think that criticism is fair, and I just caution you, Mr. Cooper. You repeated those questions time and time again, and I'll just warn you, you're an experienced counsel.
Sir, sometimes, as we all know, as experienced counsel, you re-ask a question, but within the context of a series of previous questions, and I'm simply asking the witness to draw what, for me, is the obvious conclusion. I don't think that the previous question was with respect to the approval of the content. Here specifically, and importantly, the question is with respect to the approval of the release of the statement. And
Well, you go ahead, rephrase the question, and I'll allow it.
Thank you. So, Mr. Rylund, just to be clear, I'm not asking whether you approved the content of the press release itself, but from our conversation, it appears that you did approve the release of the statement to the media, correct?
No, Mr. Noren approved the statement, and I indicated to Public Affairs that Mr. Noren had approved it, and it was prepared, and they could send it out. I think the distinction is the absence of not stepping in and saying, I don't believe the Legislative Assembly should send this out, is not the same as by not doing that, saying it's approving. I relayed to Public Affairs that Mr. Norn, and I asked Mr. Norn to reply by email confirming that he had approved the press release and that it was ready to go out. But no, I did not take action to prevent it from going out.
Could the press release on Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly have been released without your approval? Could your staff have done this without your approval?
Yes, because there are times where, as acting clerk, I am not involved in the review and preparation of a member's media statement. The difference at this time was my involvement at the request of Mr. Norn.
But whether it's exceptional, unique, or otherwise, the press release, which is the subject of this inquiry in part, could not have been issued to the CBC without your agreement to have it issued to the CBC and other media, correct?
No. Had Mr. Noren relayed the message directly that it was approved, it could have been sent out. As I indicated earlier, it's, had there been a statement, well, it's getting into speculation, but had there been a statement saying that Mr. Norn had followed all the rules, I may have intervened in terms of sending it out. But once a member has approved their statement, it doesn't need to come before me for approval. Like I said, my involvement was unusual because I was involved at the request of Mr. Norn and assisting him.
2 seconds. Yeah. Actually, yeah. Mr. Halabi is correctly noted. We probably should be breaking for the interpreters, and I committed the sin of forgetting that they're in the background.
Yeah, Mr. Cooper, that point is well taken. I understand there's only one interpreter, and my instructions are that we should give the interpreter, should be a break so the interpreter has a chance to rest. This has been going on since 9:30, so I'm going to adjourn for 15 minutes, Madam Clerk.
Thank you, sir. This hearing stands adjourned for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson.
That was quick.
You go right ahead, Mr. Cooper. You're continuing your cross-examination.
Okay, thank you so much. Is it fair to say, Mr. Rutland, that the Legislative Assembly protects what its letterhead is associated with?
We have a visual identity policy which governs the use of our name and logo.
So the integrity of the Legislative Assembly is reflected, the importance of the integrity of the Legislative Assembly is reflected on the Assembly's protection of the use of its letterhead, correct?
No, I think the single biggest effect on the integrity of the Legislative Assembly is the conduct of the members of the Legislative Assembly. I would say secondary is its logo and name.
Yeah, that's great. I'm talking about the logo as it appears on documents. Okay, so let's just try to focus on that. So, as the logo, Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly, contained on the top, among other things, of the press release of April 23rd of this year, that logo is protected by you and other members of the Assembly. Not anybody can use it for any reason, correct?
Yes, its use is governed by the visual identity policy.
And part of the reason for that, as I understand it, is that anything that goes out on Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly letterhead will, it's understood, tend to reflect the Legislative Assembly. Correct?
Yes.
I can't just go out and do a press release and, as a lawyer in the South, issue a press release with this letterhead, can I?
Well, anyone with computer skills probably could, but it would be against our visual identity policy, yes.
Okay. And the Legislative Assembly would jealously guard, and does jealously guard, the use of its letterhead, correct?
We are responsible for the use of our logo, our name, as well as the crest of the Northwest Territories, the official crest of the Northwest Territories.
And am I correct in saying that the Legislative Assembly jealously guards the use of all of what you've just described?
I wouldn't agree with the word jealously. We have a requirement to manage the use of our name, our logo, and crest.
You understood in April of this year that the use of the Legislative Assembly letterhead on the press release issued on April 23rd of this year would be reasonably perceived by the public as representing a pronouncement from the Legislative Assembly, correct? You understood that?
I understood it to be a pronouncement from a member of the Legislative Assembly.
And do members have the ability and the authority to issue their own press releases under their own name and under their own letterhead?
Yes.
And that would be a distinct communication in which only the member is represented in that pronouncement if they use their own letterhead, right?
Members generally don't have their own letterhead. If a member was making a media statement, it would go out on the same format that Mr. Noren's went out, and then it would just identify that it is a statement from a member versus a statement from the Legislative Assembly, or a statement from the Speaker, or from the Board of Management.
You understood, though, in April of this year that a member of the public reading the press release with the Legislative Assembly letterhead would reasonably presume that this is a pronouncement from the Legislative Assembly, not just Mr. Norn, correct? You understood that?
Well, Mr. Noren, as a member of the Legislative Assembly, yes.
Okay, but Mr. Norn, I think we agree in law and politics, doesn't speak for the Legislative Assembly, right? You understood that?
It depends on the context in which Mr. Norn is speaking, but yes. In this context, no, he was not speaking for the Assembly.
Okay, and the only person generally with the right to speak on behalf of the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories is the Premier, correct?
That is incorrect.
Okay, well, who else speaks on behalf of the Legislative Assembly?
The Premier does not speak on behalf of the Legislative Assembly. The Premier speaks on behalf of the government of the Northwest Territories. The Speaker of the Legislative Assembly would be the person who would speak on behalf of the Legislative Assembly, because those are different branches of government, Mr. Cooper.
And I appreciate that the error was made by me in that regard. So, replace the word Premier with the word Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. Only the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly speaks on behalf of the Legislative Assembly, barring a delegation of that authority, correct?
No, members who have other roles within the Legislative Assembly, for example, members who are a chair of a standing committee of the Legislative Assembly, or, for example, if they are a member of the Board of Management of the Legislative Assembly, they may also speak effectively. Those are arms of the Legislative Assembly and could be interpreted as speaking on behalf of the Assembly.
Did Mr. Norn, at any point, after he was elected to the 19th Assembly, have the right to speak on behalf of the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly?
He was able to speak on behalf of the Standing Committee on Accountability and Oversight of the Legislative Assembly. Yes, as its chair.
In that capacity. Is that right? Just in that capacity?
That's what I said, yes.
Okay, and I understand that that's a delegated authority from the Speaker, in effect.
No, that authority is delegated to Mr. Noren by the members of the Standing Committee on Accountability and Oversight who elected him as their chair.
And when he's speaking as the chairman, was it your understanding in April of this year that he was speaking on behalf of the entire Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly?
When he was speaking when?
As a chairman of any committee of the Assembly?
He would certainly be speaking on behalf of that part of the Assembly, yes. As the Assembly as a whole, no.
Let's go back to my original question. The only person empowered to speak on behalf of the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly is the Speaker of the House. Correct?
Yes.
You understood in April of this year that a press release on the letterhead of the Legislative Assembly would reasonably be perceived by members of the public as a pronouncement of the Legislative Assembly, i.e. the Speaker, not the individual MLA, correct?
No, we routinely issue statements on behalf of members in the same format, on the same letterhead that is issued on behalf of Mr. Noren on that day. What we do is we indicate who the statement is from in the statement. So the Speaker alone does not have the right to use the Legislative Assembly letterhead. Mr. Noren, as a member of the Legislative Assembly, can also use that. So no, I would not say I would not consider it a pronouncement of the Speaker or the Legislative Assembly, because it specifically stated it was a statement from Mr. Noren as the member for Unidentified.
Did you consider, though, the impression that a member of the public may have with respect to a press release issued by the Legislative Assembly as opposed to the individual member? Did that take any part of your consideration at the time in April?
No, because it is routine practice.
No. Routine for you and understood by you, but did you give any consideration of how such statements are perceived by the public? That they seem reasonably to be pronouncements of the Assembly, which is listed prominently at the top of the document.
Generally, that document is only seen by members of the media and then is reproduced in other forms. That was identified as a statement from Mr. Noren. I would consider it for people to consider it a statement from Mr. Noren as the member for Unidentified.
Okay, so the answer to the question is no, you didn't consider that.
No, because it's a routine practice and this is something we normally do.
Had Mr. Norn so chosen, he could have simply issued his own press release with his own name on the top without any reference to the logo or the name Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly, correct?
That's not the practice within the Legislative Assembly. Had Mr. Norn done that, that's something I think we would have had a conversation with him about, but that is not the practice. The practice is that members who want to issue a statement will generally issue it through Legislative Assembly Public Affairs and Communications.
I don't want to misquote you, but you said something in the essence of, that's something that we would have a conversation with him about. Do you remember just saying that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. What would you perceive the nature of that conversation to be, Mr. Rylund?
My conversation, the conversation that I would have with a member who did that is to find out why they felt they couldn't access the services of the Legislative Assembly to do that, because we make all these services available to them.
You certainly don't encourage members from issuing their own press releases, correct?
Well, we encourage them to issue press statements through Public Affairs and Communications.
Well, let's look at the reverse of that. Do you encourage, in any circumstances, a member to issue a press release under their own name and not that of the Legislative Assembly?
No.
Why?
Because we are here to provide these services to members, and if a member is acting in their capacity as a member of the Legislative Assembly, they should be properly identified as such.
So your office, the deputy clerk or the clerk's office, needs to be involved in the issuance of press releases in their perspective, from their perspective, correct?
Well, you would have to ask members what their perspective is, but it is routine practice and a service that we offer to members that our Public Affairs and Communications staff are available to assist them.
Okay, but the clerk's office prefers the Legislative Assembly members to issue press releases exclusively through the Legislative Assembly, correct?
Sorry, did you say prefer that
Yes.
Certainly that would be my preference. I can't speak for everyone who's been clerk of the Legislative Assembly, but that would be my preference.
Well, in April of this year, you were the clerk, the acting clerk, correct?
Yes.
And was it your preference that all press releases go through your office while you were acting as the clerk?
It depends what you mean by go through our office. There were other releases by members during my time as acting clerk that I did not review because the member worked directly with Public Affairs and did that. As I indicated earlier, this situation was different because Mr. Noren contacted me seeking advice and assistance in preparing the media statement.
Okay. Well, when I say your office, I'm speaking more globally. So the other statements to which you refer presumably did go through your office, if not through your specific clerk's office. It went through your staff, right?
Formal media statements, yes. To my knowledge, they all went through the office of the clerk, through Public Affairs.
And are members told of that preference, that they go through your office, your staff, as clerk?
They're certainly told that resource is available for them, and that is the method to follow. The specific wording that's in the member's handbook, I don't have in front of me.
Are members told that they can issue their own press releases under their own name without the Legislative Assembly logo or name on the top?
I don't know whether they were told that or not. I was not part of the media training.
Did you tell Mr. Norn at any point that if you don't like my advice and you want to include things I disagree with or exclude things that I think should be in there, that he could issue his own press release?
During my conversation with him, no.
Why not?
It didn't come up. It wasn't something that Mr. Norn raised.
Well, he's looking to you for advice. You understood that back in April, correct?
Yes, and we provided support and assistance in preparing a media statement for him.
And you told him what you thought about the contents of the press release, right? You're offering proactive advice.
No, I told him that he couldn't say in the press statement that he had followed all the rules because, in fact, he had not. So that was that was the context in which I gave him that advice.
But you didn't identify an alternative, which is you can put out your own press release if you want.
No, because I think had Mr. Noren asked about the possibility of that, I would have given him the same advice that was included in my email, that to put a statement out like that is incorrect would be problematic. In the email I sent to him, I said it was really important that all the information in there was correct and accurate because my expectation was the media would follow through on it.
But it's important to the clerk's office to have the statements go through their office for whatever reason. That's important to the clerk's office, correct?
No, I think it's a standard practice. It's a service we offer to members, and it's a service that members take advantage of, including Mr. Noren.
Well, it seems to me, though, that maybe the reason that they do that is nobody in your office is telling them they have alternatives. Is that a reasonable conclusion?
No, I can't say why MLAs choose to do what they do.
Okay. Can you think of a time as either law clerk or deputy clerk or acting clerk in which a member has actually issued their own press release without involving your office?
Well, when I was law clerk, that wasn't part of my functions or part of my responsibility. Since my time as deputy clerk, I'm not aware of a member who has done that. We have had members issue their own committee reports under their names as dissenting opinions. There's been other things that members have done. Members have moved their own motions outside of committees and things like that. So there are times where members do act independently. But to my knowledge, I'm not aware of a statement being issued personally. Sometimes members will respond to media inquiries by email, and that certainly doesn't go through the same sort of statement process where an actual statement is.
Is it fair to say that members issuing their own press release is discouraged by your staff and your office?
No, I would say I would discourage a member from doing that, particularly where the information is incorrect or not true. But I would encourage a member to take advantage of our services.
But that's going to be subject in the end to something that's acceptable to the Legislative Assembly because it's on their letterhead. They know that, presumably.
You would have to ask the members what it is they know.
Well, what's your understanding then?
My understanding is that a member would expect the Legislative Assembly to want to ensure that the information that's being provided is accurate.
Or at least somebody's version of what's accurate, I suppose.
Based on what we're told is accurate.
Your evidence earlier referred to what you alleged was a purported political exemption that Mr. Norn, you say, told you about. Am I recalling that correctly?
Yes, it was something he raised in a telephone conversation I had with him when
and you weren't...
Sorry, Mr. Cooper.
Go ahead.
When I had a conversation with him about whether or not when I called him indicating that he had attended at the Legislative Assembly.
And did you have any idea what he was talking about in terms of a political exemption?
No.
No idea?
No, because to my knowledge, no member had previously had anything to that effect. And when a member had previously sought a declaration that they be essential so that they could attend proceedings near the end of their isolation, they had been specifically told that that is not something the Legislative Assembly would allow or seek. And the Speaker had previously issued that members who are isolating are not allowed on the precinct.
We were provided through your counsel, Mr. Kruger, with a copy of the exposure control plan that was in place in April. The first version that we have appears to have been issued January 27th of this year. You're familiar with that protocol?
I'm familiar with the exposure control program, yes.
Okay, and so we looked after hearing what you had to say about an exemption, and we were drawn to page 5, and I don't know if you have that in front of you, but I can certainly read into the record the portion to which I intend to make reference. This might give you some insight into what you think you heard. Controlling the number of people within the Legislative Assembly building, about halfway down the page, that's the title. Only essential staff will be permitted within the Legislative Assembly. When making this assessment, we ask that you consider the following. This has to do with other people other than Mr. Norn, so I'm going to skip over that. The following essential staff for the Legislative Assembly has been determined and includes, and there's some bullets after this, your office staff, the office of the clerk, staff as identified by the clerk of the Legislative Assembly. So it sounds like you had a bit of an exemption. Members, period. Members will identify essential staff. So it sounds like, Mr. Upton, that Mr. Norn, as a member, had what reasonably could be called an exemption. Would you agree?
No, that's not an exemption from the public health order or from the isolation requirements. It relates to who is able to access the building when the building is generally closed to the public or when we are sitting.
You know that Mr. Norn is not a lawyer, right?
Yes.
So he responds to your concern about attending on the 17th by saying, you recall, that he had some sort of political exemption. Do you think he could have been referring to this exemption in the COVID protocol, the control plan?
No.
Why is that?
Because he indicated that his exemption related to isolation, and he had also referenced that in his view, he thought there was also other Indigenous chiefs who had received exemptions from isolation requirements.
Would you agree with me that what I've just read to you would seem to identify a small group of people as being treated differently than the general public in terms of entering the Legislative Assembly in April?
No, there's several classes of people. The general public were not allowed within the Legislative Assembly at all, and there was restrictions in place respecting the public health orders as to people who could be in the building, and so there were different groups of people. So where if there was limits on the number of people in the building, those would be the priority people to be in. So yes, as a member, he had a different status in terms of access to the building, but that did not relate to requirements to follow the isolation orders. And in fact, the speaker had previously prevented members from participating while they were still isolating.
And do you have any information that Mr. Noren was aware of that particular instance that you just described, where certain members were precluded from the building?
Yes, as chair of the Standing Committee on Accountability and Oversight, every day while the House is sitting, we address ministers and members' absences and the reason for that. And Mr. Noren was chair of that committee, so he would have been present when we had those discussions.
So the speaker in that case, as I understand what you're saying, would preclude members who had tested positive, correct? They weren't allowed in the building?
No, people who had been in exposure risk and been isolating. For example, when COVID first started, there were a couple of members who attended a conference in Toronto where there was a COVID exposure and then were required to isolate upon their return and were not in the House for votes as a result. We'd also had another member who had been south on medical who was isolating, and we'd had two members in that situation who were unable to attend either a committee meeting or a sitting day because they were in their isolation period.
And so in other words, those members were excluded from the prohibition against attending the Legislative Assembly.
No, the speaker specifically precluded them from, indicated to them that as they were isolating as a result of a possible exposure, they were not allowed onto the parliamentary precinct, which is within the discretion of the Speaker.
Of course. And so, in other words, nobody is allowed to come to the Legislative Assembly under the exposure control plan passed in January of this year, except members of the clerk's office, members and identified constituency assistants, the Premier's office and the Premier's office essential staff, and certain contractors that meet a certain requirement, correct? That are approved by the Sergeant at Arms. Everybody else is excluded.
No, there are other people. Our exposure control plan also provides that if there are other people who need to attend at the Legislative Assembly for an essential purpose, the Sergeant at Arms can approve that. That could include potentially senior members of the public service who need to come and meet with ministers. It could also include, members of the Intergovernmental Council, Aboriginal leaders who may be coming in to meet with members. So there was always the opportunity for people to seek, for them to contact the Sergeant at Arms to see whether or not someone could come in.
So in other words, they had the opportunity to contact the Sergeant at Arms to seek an exemption from the prohibition.
Sure.
Okay. Sir, I'm just going to need maybe 5 minutes. I'm near the end of my examination. I just want to make sure I haven't missed anything. Maybe make it 10 minutes so that the interpreters have a couple more minutes to gather their...
We'll make it 10 minutes, Mr. Cooper. We'll adjourn for 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
This hearing is adjourned for 10 minutes. This hearing is resumed following an adjournment.
Mr. Cooper?
Thank you, sir. I hope we won't be going too much longer. I don't think we'll have to take another break before lunch, just put it that way. So, Mr. Rylund, you acknowledge you're still under oath?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and you've not discussed your evidence during the break with anybody, I trust?
No, I have not.
Okay, take no offense. I asked those series of questions in some form or another after each break. So, subsequent to the press release, you became aware that Mr. Noren had made statements to CBC and cabin radio that you felt to be untrue, correct?
To cabin radio the next day, yes.
Okay. So how did that communication first come to your attention?
I was driving into work and a member contacted me and said that there was a story on cabin radio, that Mr. Noren had followed all the rules. When I arrived at the Legislative Assembly, I was still in my vehicle. I took a look at the article and then I called Mr. Noren. And Mr. Noren answered. I asked Mr. Noren whether he had told cabin radio that he had followed the rules. Mr. Noren asked me if Ollie Williams had called me, and I said, no, there's a story on the website with that statement in quotes.
And what was the rest of the conversation?
Mr. Noren indicated that he had picked up by mistake, and that we discussed whether or not he wanted to issue a clarifying statement or address the fact that, and he indicated to me he was not going to do any other media.
Did he say no other media ever, or just that day on that issue?
I can't remember the exact words. He also sent an email because I had emailed him and saying once the news had broken that he had been at the Legislative Assembly, we were going to be issuing a statement, and I had sent that statement to Mr. Noren for his information.
When you say we, to whom are you referring?
So it would have been myself and our public affairs team who would have prepared that. And then I emailed it to Mr. Noren so that he was aware of the statement that we'd be making. And he, again, replied by email and said he would not be doing any media.
So in your initial conversation after hearing or reading the report on cabin radio, you asked Mr. Noren if he wanted to issue a press release in response. Is that right?
I don't know whether I said a press release, whether he wanted to make a clarifying statement. Was more likely the discussions that I used, whether he wanted to make a statement clarifying it, and he said no.
Okay, your last answer suggests to me you don't have a clear recollection of that conversation. Do you have a clear recollection of that conversation?
I remember speaking with him during that conversation. I remember the start of that conversation. Whether or not I said press statement, media statement, or a clarifying statement, that I don't recall. What I do recall was my first couple of comments with Mr. Noren, because they were specifically contrary to what we had discussed the night before.
Did you take or keep any notes of that conversation?
No, not that I recall. I was in my vehicle at the time.
My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you had arrived at the Legislative Assembly, having first heard of the matter on your way to the Legislative Assembly, but that when you called Mr. Noren, you were already at the Legislative Assembly.
I was in the parking lot in my vehicle.
You called Mr. Noren from your car rather than your office?
Yes, that's correct.
Any particular reason for that?
Because it was my first opportunity to call Mr. Noren after I finished driving, and felt that it was important I make that call quickly.
The cabin radio report that you're referring to, was that the online written report, or was it something on the radio itself?
My understanding is it's the online report. Is that
Okay,
that's
so
what
you're
had
gonna
been
have to help me
that's what had been relayed to me.
Okay, you're going to have to help me understand that. You got a call from somebody indicating that there was a report in which Mr. Norn referred to the fact that he had followed the rules. Is that right?
A report online, yes.
Okay. You heard about that report online while you were driving to the Legislative Assembly, correct?
Correct.
You heard about that report while you were driving to the Legislative Assembly because somebody called you?
Yes.
Who called you?
A member of the Legislative Assembly.
Yes. Which member?
I would prefer, members require a certain amount of discretion, so I would prefer to just say that it was a member, a sitting member of the Legislative Assembly.
Okay, and please provide the name.
I think we can leave it up to the adjudicator as to whether or not the name of the member is important, given the concerns stated by Mr. Rutland.
I don't think it's necessary to have the name, so I'm going to instruct the witness not to answer that question.
Well, sir, the source of information of any witness is almost always relevant. And while we can appreciate the well-grounded and understandable desire to protect the names of the innocent, shall we call them, during an inquiry, it seems that it's important, like any other inquiry, judicial or otherwise, to know the source of information. And it may be that this will generate additional evidence and additional witnesses because what he was told may be the subject of further inquiry, because this leads to a whole series of questions and inquiries that we have. Why he did what he did. And if we're limited to relying only on his evidence, that undermines the credibility and the reliance that can be placed on it. Much like everything else, where Mr. LaPrairie quite rightly called Mr. Rutland, subpoenaed Mr. Rutland after hearing what other witnesses said, we too must have that right. And the only way to do that is to know the source of the information. And I don't think... Go ahead.
Mr. Cooper, the information that has been relayed, there's no dispute on it because several witnesses talk about it. It's been put in evidence. And I don't see anything necessary in this case in the interest of justice as why you need the name of the member, and I'm not going to allow it.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rutland, what specifically did this unidentified member tell you?
A member told me that there was a report online by Cabin Radio saying that Mr. Noren had followed the rules.
What was the rest of the conversation with this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly?
I told the member that I would need to look at the story and then I would need to speak with Mr. Noren.
And what did the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly say to you?
They understood that that would be...
What you've already related.
They understood that that's what I would have to do.
Was there any other conversation between you on that occasion and the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly?
I think that the one thing that I recall is I think the member was upset that Mr. Noren had said that because this member was aware he had been at the Legislative Assembly.
And did this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly indicate to you how it was that they had become aware of this information?
No.
Did you ask this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly how they were in possession of this information?
They referred to a report online, which I assumed meant a public report because Cabin Radio posts news articles online and on their social media.
Did this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly indicate what they wanted you or hoped that you would do in response to this report?
No.
Did this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly indicate what they were going to do as a result of this information?
No.
Did you ask this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly what they were going to do?
No.
Why not?
I advised them what steps I was going to be taking.
And what did you identify to this somewhat ironically unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly that you were going to do?
I told them, as I testified earlier, that I would need to speak with Mr. Noren about it. And that was what I was going to do.
And you told them that you would do that after you read the report from Cabin Radio, correct?
If that's what I said earlier, yes.
Well, what's your memory? I presume your memory is no better now than it was a few minutes ago. What do you remember telling them in that regard?
That I would have to look at it and that I would have to speak to Mr. Noren.
Do you actually have that memory, or is that just what you suppose you did?
I believe that's what I've already said, which is my memory of what I said a few minutes ago, Mr. Cooper.
But you seem... Okay, let's distinguish what you remember saying a few minutes ago with your active memory at the time that this conversation took place with the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly. Okay?
Yeah, well, I indicated to them that I would speak to Mr. Noren. I most likely indicated that I would have to look at it and speak with Mr. Noren because that is what my normal instinct would be. But as
you don't
to
remember that part of the conversation?
No, as to the specific words I said, is that part of the conversation? No. The gist of that conversation for me was that this was brought to my attention and it was something I needed to follow up on.
So the member asked you to follow up. The unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly asked you to follow up on the information that he or she had just provided you. Is that right?
No, I said I would speak with Mr. Noren about it.
Did the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly indicate anything that they wanted you to do?
No.
Okay. And to whom did you report this communication?
I reported it. I believe I reported it to Mr. Noren because I told him that this had been brought to my attention.
You believe, but you don't recall reporting it to Mr. Norn?
No, I recall discussing with Mr. Noren whether I said it was that I received a call from a member or whether I just said this is what Cabin Radio says. I can't recall.
Okay. Did you report this conversation with the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly to anyone else other than Mr. Norn?
Not that I recall, no.
Okay. So you don't recall reporting your conversation with this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly to maybe yet another as yet unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly?
No, I would not have discussed it with other members at the time. I may have spoken to one of my deputy clerks, but aside from that, no. I required to have a fair amount of discretion in terms of my conversation with members.
But you do recall contacting Mr. Norn in reference to the Cabin Radio report after having received the information from the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly. Is that right?
Yes, because I was concerned that his statement was inaccurate and not correct. And that was my primary concern because we had discussed, and I had said the night before that that is something he should not say.
When you say you said that the night before, you're referring to communications with Mr. Norn, right?
Yes, during the preparation of his media statement.
So to the best of your recollection, Mr. Rylund, what precisely did this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly say to you that he or she felt was inaccurate as contained in the Cabin Radio report?
They didn't say that. I said, in my mind, I felt it was inaccurate. My understanding is that this member was aware that Mr. Noren had been at the Assembly during that period, and was concerned that he said that he had followed all the rules because he had not. But that was what was in my mind with that statement, because, you know, probably 10, 12 hours earlier, we had had a specific conversation about not saying that.
Let's break down this word "that." Was it your understanding that from this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly that Cabin Radio had reported that he had followed all of the rules, or that he had not attended on April 17, 2021?
It was said to me that they reported he had followed all of the rules.
And that was the precise phrase that you had counseled against using and refused to put in the press release the previous evening, correct?
That is the language that we had used, and I had said that he should not put that in the press release the evening before, and Mr. Norn agreed.
Sorry, are you certain that he made specific reference to following all the rules? Or is your memory such that he might have made reference to not attending the Legislative Assembly?
It was about following all the rules, and I believe that was the quote that was in the Cabin Radio article.
Okay, but that was after acquired information, Mr. Rylund. So I'm wondering what you recall specifically was said to you by this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly in reference to what they took objection to based on their knowledge of Mr. Noren's attendance at the Assembly. What did they say that they took objection to in as precise a wording as is possible?
That he said he had followed all the rules.
You're certain about that?
Yes.
How long did the conversation take place between you and this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly?
It would have been relatively short because I would have been driving at the time. So it would have been a short, hands-free conversation.
Okay, well, you're a lawyer. You know how we have to pounce on the word "would have been." So what do you actually recall as opposed to what you would suppose?
A couple of minutes. It would have been short because I drive in along the Ingram Trail and don't have consistent cell service the whole way. So it would have been a short, and I recall it being a short conversation.
And how far away from the Legislative Assembly did you receive the phone call?
I don't know where I was in terms of the drive-in. It's a half-hour drive.
And as you say, cell service along the Ingram Trail can be spotty. So I'm wondering if that can help us understand how much time there was between when you had the phone call and when you arrived at the Legislative Assembly.
There is cell service the whole way. There are dips, spots where the call will drop. So I would say it would have been within probably 15, 20 minutes of the Legislative Assembly. Would not have been within the first 2 minutes.
Do you recall the call dropping at all when you were speaking with this unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly?
No, it did not drop.
So within 15 minutes of the call, you were at the Legislative Assembly. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And you earlier indicated that you called Mr. Norn from your car. Is that right?
Truck, yes.
Vehicle. How about that?
Perfect.
I take it at that point you hadn't read the article that the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly had made reference to?
I don't have a specific recollection whether I looked it up on my phone first before I called Mr. Noren or whether I called Mr. Noren immediately. I don't have a specific recollection of that.
Is that just simply by act of the passage of time?
Yes, what I do remember was my conversation with Mr. Noren, because that's what I was concerned with. In terms of the article, because I've read the article numerous times, I can't say whether I read it before or after. I just don't recall.
Okay, so you don't remember the order of events. You do recall quite clearly, it seems, the words that were uttered to you by the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly. You remember driving roughly 15 minutes. You remember calling Mr. Norn from your truck in the Assembly parking lot, but you don't remember where in the order of events you first read the cabin radio report. Is that right?
Yes, I don't know whether I read it before or after I spoke with him. I had read it at some point. I don't recall whether I called him first or whether I read it first. And there was just a lot going on at the time.
Yes, for you and Mr. Norn. I think on that we can agree. It strikes me, though, Mr. Rutland, that your conversation with Mr. Norn would be substantially different based on whether you had read the report or not before you spoke with them. Is that a fair conclusion?
I'm not sure, because my concern was this report that Mr. Norn had said he had followed all the rules. So, had I read the cabin radio article and there was nothing to that effect, then likely that would have changed the phone call. But my concern was Mr. Noren making a statement saying he had followed all the rules when he knew he had not.
But if you hadn't read the report, like you indicated you intended to do, you were merely relying on the hearsay of an unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly. Or did you have some other information?
Well, hearsay is a legal term, Mr. Cooper. I was contacted by a member of the Legislative Assembly, who I work with all the members closely, who advised me that this was what was reported. There's no reason for me to doubt the veracity of the report that I'm receiving from a member of the Legislative Assembly.
But in the same breath, Mr. Rutland, you'd agree that it would have been prudent to read the report about which you were to have a discussion with Mr. Norn before you had that discussion, correct?
Sure, that was prudent, but the steps that I took, I don't feel are what is at issue here. But if that is your conclusion and what you believe to be the prudent steps, then yes, I agree.
You're sure that you didn't have this conversation with Mr. Norn after the report from the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly after you were in your office already? You're sure it was in your truck in the parking lot?
Yes, I recall that quite vividly.
And I take it wasn't your practice to record relatively contemporaneously any notes of such conversations?
No, I had, on occasion, I would take notes of conversations, but at this point, like I said, I was sitting in my car because I felt this was an urgent matter that needed to be dealt with.
Okay, because what I'm getting at, Mr. Rutland, is the subpoena very specifically obliges you to bring certain information along, and I'm not convinced at this point that that part of the subpoena has been complied with. And certainly now, and I can raise it more specifically at the end of your cross-examination, I am asking the adjudicator to direct you to review your records to determine what notes and other records you may possess that are relevant to the issues that have come up in the inquiry, including, quite frankly, things that may not have been anticipated by the parties, but are now reasonably obvious on the basis of the examinations and cross-examinations to date. But, sir, I'll ask that that be left until the end. I'm simply raising it as an indication of where conversations took place could be relevant. Do you know if the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly, do you recall them following up with you at all about their concern about what they read or heard on cabin radio?
Not that I recall, no.
From your earlier answers to my questions, you indicated that you asked Mr. Norn if he wanted to do anything in response to the cabin radio report, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Did you specifically give him any advice on what his options might be in the circumstances?
We would have discussed, you know, do I remember specific language? No, but we would have said, do you want to do a statement clarifying this? And the indication was no.
There's that phrase Mr. Rutland would have. What do you recall as opposed to what you are supposing to have been the case?
I recall raising the possibility of issuing a clarifying statement.
Did you advise Mr. Norn that it would be a good idea to do precisely that? Or did you simply raise the possibility as you've described?
In terms of my recollection, I would say that I recollect raising it. I don't recall whether I told him or not that would have been a good thing for him to do. It's not my job to instruct members.
I didn't ask if you instructed. You've acknowledged previously that your role in this regard is to give advice, correct?
Procedural advice, yes.
Well, procedural advice in this case included how to deal with the public and the media, correct?
Sure.
So why didn't you recommend to Mr. Norn that he take the prudent course and issue a statement, a press release, give an interview or something to correct that which he had improperly, allegedly disclosed to cabin radio?
Well, certainly providing that as an option to him is recommending that as one course of action. You know, if I didn't think that was a good idea, I would not have raised that with Mr. Norn.
So the extent of your service to Mr. Norn post cabin radio interview was you have this option. That's it. Is that right?
That's what I recall, yes.
Did you encourage Mr. Norn to take any steps to protect him or more generally the Assembly in this regard?
Yeah, well, our whole discussion about whether or not he would have declared this in the first place hours earlier would have addressed that and did address the fact that did you want to address this or did you not? And Mr. Norn did not. He just wanted to stick to sharing publicly the diagnosis of COVID-19.
Well, that was true of the previous day, but circumstances, I think you'd agree, had changed because of what he had said to cabin radio and what you knew to be the truth and not the truth, correct?
Yes.
You knew that Mr. Noren was going to get himself into trouble with the media and the public and, as it happens, be the subject of a public inquiry if he didn't correct what you thought was an error, correct?
No, I didn't know all those things were going to happen as a result of this. I can't see the future.
You knew that some of these things were going to occur, correct?
I knew he might be questioned about the inaccuracy of his statements because I had flagged that concern for him the night prior.
You knew that the media was going to find out about the April 17th attendance at the Legislative Assembly, right?
No, I did not know that the media at that time was going to know about that.
Did you consider that the media was likely to find out about it?
No, what I had advised Mr. Noren was that, the fact is that he had not complied and couldn't say otherwise because we had knowledge to that effect. But no, at the time, I did not know that it would be reported that Mr. Noren publicly was at the Assembly. I had not released that information publicly.
No, I appreciate that you knew certain things, but in your role as an advisor to people in a position such as Mr. Norn, you have to try to anticipate what might happen and prepare for that happenstance, correct?
Yes, and I had provided Mr. Noren that advice, and based on the report from cabin radio, Mr. Noren had chosen not to follow it.
Okay, and you should then at that point have given him new advice, correct?
Which was the possibility of issuing a clarifying statement.
Do you understand the difference between information and advice, Mr. Rylund?
Yes, I advise members on the things that they can do. Ultimately, members are responsible for making their decisions. You know, Mr. Noren has, like, as I indicated previously, publicly chastised us for providing too much advice or telling them what they should be doing. So Mr. Noren, you know, I was providing all of the options to Mr. Noren that he had, and was more than prepared to discuss every option with Mr. Noren if that's what he wanted to do. But I can't make members consider all of these different things.
Why did you give Mr. Noren information devoid of advice after you learned what cabin radio had reported?
Well, I wouldn't say it was devoid of advice. In giving him the options as to what he could do, there is an advisory aspect to that. And ultimately, you know, that would have been, sorry, you don't like that when I say that, but ultimately, I expect that was an element of the discussion. But I can't lead a member's discussions. I can say, this is what you can do, and we can talk about the merits and benefits of, or cons of doing certain things. But you know, I think saying just providing information is devoid of providing advice is not correct.
Well, you could have, and I suggest you should have, given Mr. Noren advice as to how best to repair the damage that you perceived he had done. Why didn't you say, I recommend X, or I suggest Y, and I think you should do Z? It sounds like that part of the conversation was missing on the 24th of April, but was a valid and important part of your engagement with Mr. Noren on the 23rd, when the press release was issued.
Well, I had already provided Mr. Noren advice, and he had chosen not to follow it. I was doing my best to provide Mr. Noren with all of the options and all of the information he needed to deal with this situation.
And in your opinion, you gave Mr. Noren all the advice that he needed to make a good decision post-cabin radio interview, but that he presumably decided not to take that advice. Is that what you're saying?
Well, to the extent that Mr. Noren was prepared to engage in a conversation about that. Like I said, I can't necessarily lead the whole conversation, so I raise information, we have a discussion, and we move on. I can't speak to what was going on with Mr. Noren on his side of that conversation.
You should have given Mr. Noren some advice, and I submit to you, Mr. Rylund, you let him down by simply giving him information without recommending that he do one thing or another. Is that a fair statement?
No, I personally take great offense to any statement saying that we did not provide Mr. Noren with support, advice, and information. When I became acting clerk, the first thing that I said to our management team was that regardless of Mr. Noren's public comments on the character and attributes of the professional public servants in the office of the clerk, that he was entitled to and had to receive all of the services and benefits that a member received. Following Mr. Noren's public statement regarding the diagnosis of COVID-19 and all of the resulting events, I spoke with Mr. Noren on a daily basis to check in on him, to provide him with assistance. That went on for an extended period of time. It then became every other day, and then moved gradually to every 3 days, just to ensure that Mr. Noren was okay, that he was doing all right, and was receiving the support and services that he required. And that continued all the way up to and including August of this year.
Yes, and I understand that, Mr. Rylund, and nobody is saying that, generally speaking, what you're saying is untrue. What I'm suggesting to you is on this important one occasion, you let Mr. Norn down because you didn't give him recommendations and advice, but rather gave him information. You gave him options. Whereas your obligation, as you had carried out previously, was to provide advice, direction, recommendations. You didn't do that with respect to what happened on cabin radio. Would you agree with that statement?
No.
Well, what advice did you give him with respect to cabin radio?
What I said is I don't recall, Mr. Cooper, what I said is I don't recall all of the specifics of that conversation. I indicated to you that that is something I would have discussed, which you took exception to. So I have not said I did not do those things. What I have said is I do not recall. So I'm not prepared to say that he did not receive satisfactory assistance or that he was let down at that day, because we were doing, and I personally was doing everything possible to support Mr. Noren during this process. But for your specific question, I cannot say with 100% certainty how exactly I worded those things, so I'm not prepared to say that I in fact did them.
Okay, fair enough. You subsequently heard or learned of a report on CBC radio. That's correct, I take it?
It was sometime later, probably about 2 weeks later.
Did you approach Mr. Norn with any information or advice with respect to how to deal with what he had said to CBC radio?
No, Mr. Noren had spoken to CBC Radio without first seeking advice. And in that, he indicated, Mr. Noren indicated that, in fact, he had breached his isolation and was prepared to deal with the consequences of it. And quite frankly, there's no other advice that I would have given him based on that. He made what I consider to be an accurate statement.
Sir, I'm going to ask for your indulgence. This definitely went along a little longer than I anticipated. I do think I'm done, but if I may ask for just 5 minutes to consult with my associates and hopefully bring us to a
Mr.
conclusion.
Cooper, is that enough time? Would you rather have a little more, or is 5 minutes enough? Why don't we take 10?
Beggars can't be choosy, and I'm certainly happy with 10 minutes, sir. Thank you.
This hearing stands down for 10 minutes.
Hi there.
Mr. Cooper?
Yeah, I just have one question, and whatever comes out of their famous last words, I'll do my best. Full credit to our paralegal over here, Jamie Gritt, who asked me the question that I'm now going to ask you, Mr. Rylund. What did you tell? Let me back up. Acknowledge you're still under oath? You're on mute, I think. I didn't hear your answer.
Oh, yes, I do.
Okay. And you didn't discuss your evidence with anybody during the break?
No, I did not.
So what my learned paralegal is wondering is what you told the MLA you had told Mr. Norn in reference to the press release.
Trying to remember what I would have said. I don't recall what I would have specifically said regarding what advice I had provided to Mr. Noren.
Do you remember anything about telling him that you specifically told Mr. Norn to not to say what had just been reported as him saying to cabin radio? I told him not to say that or something to that effect.
It's quite possible I said that. I don't recall whether or not I did.
Because it sort of flies in the face of your previous statement that you would never discuss what an MLA says to you with other MLAs or other people. That's why I think Ms. Grift was probably wondering what it was you said.
I think that's a fair question, and I think generally that's my practice. And if that's something I did say, I would expect it would have come out as a exasperation or from a sense of frustration, and not from a sense of divulging what one MLA says to me. I do my best to maintain discretion on behalf of all MLAs, including Mr. Noren, so in terms of that member, if I did say that, I can certainly say that that morning I was frustrated and I was exasperated that Mr. Noren had said that. That's certainly how I was feeling.
I guess we'll never know what the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly recalls of this instance because I'm not allowed to know what that individual's name might be, but I do think I'm entitled to know why you were exasperated.
Because hours earlier I had told Mr. Noren not to say that. Or I had recommended that he not say that.
Well, no, you told him not to say it. I suggest to you that that's accurate. You told Mr. Noren what to do. Don't do this, which he then relatively promptly did, and that's why you were exasperated, correct?
Yes, I would give a distinction between telling him what to do and telling him what not to do. I see a distinction in between that. But yeah, I would, that would be why I would be exasperated.
It seems like you took it a bit personally then. Had Mr. Noren had ignored your instructions not to say what he ultimately said.
No, I wouldn't take it personally. I'm not invested in the outcomes. I would be frustrated that, we provide advice to members, and this routinely happens. We provide all sorts of advice to members that they may or may not choose to follow. But I feel I was providing the best advice I could at the time.
But why were you frustrated? You see that? That, Mr. Rutland, sounds like you are personally invested, contrary to your suggestion. You're frustrated. You're exasperated. Sounds like you had a personal investment in the fact that this MLA ignored your advice. Went directly contrary to it, in fact. Is that a fair conclusion?
No, I think you're basing that on a personal outcome. You can be frustrated that Mr. Noren didn't follow that advice, and we're now in a situation where he has public statements that are incorrect, and that ultimately will be a situation that is going to have to be dealt with should the information about Mr. Noren attending at the Assembly become public.
So you were hoping that the information about his April 17th visit didn't become public, because that would create a whole bunch of work for you, wouldn't it?
No, that's not fair. It would be a situation that would have to be dealt with, but that's my job.
But the way you worded your last answer, Mr. Rylund, I have to tell you, makes it sound like you were kind of hoping that that information wouldn't come out. Is that a fair conclusion?
No, I just wasn't at that point. I did not know at that point whether or not it was going to come out. But obviously I have to consider a number of different outcomes and a number of different factors. And certainly once people were advised of exposures at the Legislative Assembly, there was a real possibility that it would become public. So no, my job is to deal with the situations that are before me at the time that they are before me.
But also, as you very carefully just outlined, anticipate other outcomes and plan accordingly, correct?
Yes, which is why I would have said to Mr. Noren about issuing a clarifying statement.
Well, you suggested it was an option, but you didn't give him advice, as I recall your evidence on that point.
I don't recall not giving him that advice, yes.
I love those double negatives, Mr. Rylund. So you're exasperated, you're frustrated, you call Mr. Norn from your car. Who else did you speak to about your now frustrated and exasperated state?
I spoke with Mr. Norn in the vehicle, and then after that I went into the Legislative Assembly, and shortly after that had a stand-up meeting with staff because we were receiving questions from staff based on Mr. Noren's public identification as to whether that he had COVID. We were getting questions from staff as to whether or not Mr. Norn had been in the building, and we had a staff meeting to discuss that.
And what did you tell them at the staff meeting in that reference?
At the staff meeting, we advised that we had a COVID exposure at the Legislative Assembly, that I was prepared to say it was Mr. Norn because Mr. Norn had publicly identified himself, that it had happened on Saturday, April 17th, or it happened on a weekend. I'm not sure if I said the specific date, but I did say it happened on a weekend, that we'd reviewed the security register, that there was minimal risk, and anyone who had had contact with Mr. Norn had already been asked to leave the building and be tested and isolate.
Okay, by anybody, you're talking about one person, Robert Brain, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I'm not sure I would have said that specifically to staff. I just would have said anyone who would have had contact with Mr. Norn had been asked to do that.
When you were speaking to the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly, did you ask him to not disclose that information to others about the fact that Mr. Noren had attended on the 17th of April?
First of all, you refer to the identified member as him. I'm not going to confirm if it's him or her. I'd prefer if you refer to them as them.
Answer the question.
Whether or not, I believe they already had knowledge that Mr. Noren was at the Legislative Assembly. I don't know. I don't think I recall saying to them, or I don't recall saying to them, not to share that information. That was information they already had before they contacted me.
Well, they contacted you on the basis that they had the information. Am I misunderstanding your previous testimony?
That was my previous testimony, is that before speaking with me, they were aware that Mr. Noren had been at the Assembly, and that's why they were calling, because they were concerned that he said he had followed the rules when in fact he had not. That was my earlier testimony, yes it was.
Okay, just wanted to be clear about that because you seemed a little less clear now than you were earlier, and I appreciate this process can be a little tiring for witnesses. So, do you remember giving the unidentified member of the Legislative Assembly any advice as to what to do with the information that they had that Mr. Noren had apparently attended on the 17th of April?
No, I told them that that at the time that I had spoken with them, I had not seen the report, but that I would speak to Mr. Noren, and I would follow up with Mr. Noren, and that was what I told them.
Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Mr. LaPrairie, do you have any
I
re-examination?
have a short re-examination about something that was raised for the first time during the cross-examination, and that relates to the political exemption that Mr. Norn mentioned to you and that you discussed with Mr. Cooper during the cross-examination. You did not raise that with me during the preparation of your witness statement, correct, Mr. President?
That's correct.
Okay. And just so I can get some details of when this was raised by Mr. Norn, this was on the phone when Mr. Norn said that he had a political exemption. Is that correct?
Yes, it would have been when I first contacted Mr. Noren about having attended at the Legislative Assembly.
So how did it come up then when you were on the phone?
Because I contacted Mr. Noren and I said that our records had indicated he was at the Legislative Assembly while he was isolating. And then Mr. Noren indicated that he had a political exemption.
Had you ever heard of such a thing at that time?
No, we had looked at whether we would have MLAs declared essential or something like that. And to my knowledge, there was no such exemption.
Did you dispute or not Mr. Norn's claim to have a political exemption?
No, because at the time I didn't know. He had indicated that to me, and at the time I didn't know. I just indicated to him the fact was that he had been at the Legislative Assembly, and we were taking the action of sending Mr. Brain for a test and for home and to isolate because he would have had contact with Mr. Noren.
Well, was any politician exempt from following the public health order that is the subject of this inquiry?
To my knowledge,
Sorry, I have to object to. I mean, you're basically asking, number one, a political question, and number two, something that in some degree goes to a core point. And I understand that this witness is not in a position to be giving legal advice, at least of that nature. It's just not.
I don't think he's giving legal advice, Mr. Cooper, and it seems to me you raised this, that it's very relevant as to whether or not that political exemption covers MLAs or the public generally. I always thought there was no exemption, but it's not a difficult question to answer, and I'm going to allow it.
Sir, if I might, though, on that point, it's not a matter of me having raised it. You know, this is an unusual circumstance where Mr. LaPrairie gets a one-on-one with every witness that he calls before he calls them and gets their sworn testimony. We're given that information. The information was not included, as both Mr. LaPrairie and I have confirmed with the witness, and suggesting that somehow because I raised it, there's additional leeway or latitude given to answer questions. I mean, I know we aren't bound by strict rules of evidence, but certainly the rule in Brown and Dunn comes to mind. It just seems to me that in any event, asking whether a political exemption exists or not is a legal question by its very nature. That's something that you can decide. But ultimately, this is really a question of whether it was said or not, as opposed to whether it exists in law or not. But certainly asking the clerk, be him a lawyer or not, that is nothing but a legal opinion sought. If the exemption exists or not, that's something that we argue in front of you. We don't listen to Mr. Rutland.
I think it goes beyond just being a legal question. Your client was on the stand for some time. I don't think he ever raised this political exemption, and so this is the first time I've heard of it. And it seems to me a witness such as Mr. Rutland, with his background and experience, would know whether or not there is a political exemption, particularly for the pandemic, and I'm going to allow him to answer.
I was not aware of any member having received a political exemption.
And did you tell that to Mr. Norn?
I don't know whether I used those specific words or not. This was one of a number of explanations that Mr. Noren provided to me.
So at the time that he raised this political exemption, you are already confirmed with him that he had been at the legislature on the 17th of April. Is that your evidence?
Yeah, that was the purpose of me speaking with Mr. Noren, was advising him that he had been at the Legislative Assembly on the 17th and that we would be, what actions we were taking as a result.
Well, and so you were talking to him over the phone. He said, I have a political exemption. Did you discontinue your discussion with him after that, or say you accepted or not that exemption?
The time, whether or not he had a political exemption, was something that would have to be looked at or considered. Like I said, to my knowledge, I was not aware of any member receiving such a distinction. And at the time, my focus was on the safety and security of employees at the Legislative Assembly, which is why my primary focus was advising Mr. Noren, you were here, you had contact with this employee, these are the steps that we are taking. What the issue, the broader issue of Mr. Noren's compliance with the public health order was beyond the scope of my initial conversation. It was simply dealing with the management of the Legislative Assembly and the safety and security of our employees.
So you say he raised it during the telephone call you had with him. Did he raise it again at any time before the press release was finalized?
No.
Okay. Now, during your questioning, you were referred to the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly Exposure Control Plan. I believe Mr. Kruger showed you a copy of it, and Mr. Noren asked you about a question with respect to page 5. Recall that?
Yes, I do.
Is that the Legislative Assembly Exposure Control Plan that was in effect in April of 2000, April in 2021?
My expectation is that was the instructions was to produce the document that was in effect at that time. It's gone through different iterations based on different public health orders, but my understanding is the one provided is the one that was in effect at that time.
I simply asked that that be marked, Mr. Barclay.
It'll be so marked. What number is that?
Exhibit 38.
Exhibit 38?
I have no further questions.
Mr. Cooper, I just wanted to explore with you as to what time you'd like to reconvene. I'm thinking of 1:45 now to come back at 1:45. Is that pushing the envelope for you?
It might be. I don't think anybody around here has actually eaten anything today. So if we could have 2 o'clock, sir, that would be better.
Then we'll adjourn to 2 o'clock, Madam Clerk.
Thank you, sir. This hearing is adjourned until 2 p.m.